Hello, good afternoon, Shagor.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you.
Okay. So, are you the student volunteer for this session?
Yes, ma'am. I'll be hosting the G Meet.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Because I'm a
Okay.
bit technologically challenged, so it feels safe to have someone as a helping hand.
Yeah, sure, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. 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 Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ritvika Roy Chaudhary, a postgraduate student at the Department of English, Presidency University, Kolkata. I, on behalf of the organizers, welcome all participants, presenters, and the chair to the parallel session 7 of the two-day international conference, Theorising Anticasteism. The current session will be chaired by Dr. Shanta Dutta. Dr. Shanta Dutta is a professor in the Department of English at Presidency University, Kolkata, uh, where she was the head of the department from 2012 to 15 and the dean of humanities and social sciences from 2013 to 16. Before this, she taught at Jadavpur University, heading the department during 2011 and 12, and at Rabindra Bharati University from 1986 to 1999. A 3-year Commonwealth Academic Staff Scholarship enabled her to research on Hardy and gain her PhD from the University of Leicester, UK in 1996. In 2011, she was a Fulbright Nehru Senior Research Fellow at Yale University, USA. Her publications include Ambivalence in Hardy, a study of his attitude to women, Palgrave, in the year 2000, a critical edition of Hardy's The Return of the Native, Worldview Press, 2007, and numerous articles in the Thomas Hardy Journal. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ritika. A very, very warm welcome to everyone in this parallel session number 7. It's the one of the sessions post lunch on the first day. Uh, we have 4 speakers, and I would like to very warmly welcome all 4 speakers, although I can see 3, not the 4th. But yes, a very, very warm welcome to Ankit Ramteke, a PhD scholar in FLU, Preetha Mukherjee, if she's there, assistant professor at an engineering college in West Bengal, Anjali Das, PhD scholar, Patna University, and Abhinav Piyush, assistant professor at the Government College of Arts and Science, Puducherry. Uh, a very warm welcome also to our guests and the audience, of course. This session, the format of all the sessions, we've been told, will be that I will introduce each of the individual speakers. They will make their presentations, and the presentations, you have 20 minutes each of you, so please stick to that religiously. And after the 4 presentations, we will open up the session for questions, comments, discussion, etc. And the speaker who is presenting will obviously keep his or her camera and microphone on. And the request to others is to switch off their cameras and microphones so that we don't have too much unnecessary sort of data being wasted. So without really, taking up more time, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the session. By the way, of course, the parallel session, you are aware this session is entitled Anticasteism and the Novel. And there are other sort of sessions later on the novel too. But this is the first session on the novel and anti-casteism. Our first speaker is Ankit Ramteke. I have his bio note here, and it says he's a first-year doctoral student at the School of Literary Studies, English and Foreign Language University, that is FLU, Hyderabad. He completed his bachelor's and master's from the University of Delhi. His research and teaching interests include Dalit literature, anti-caste literature, Indian English writings. His thesis project title, To Touch or Not to Touch, The Problem of Caste in Indian English Writing. And so that is the brief introduction to Ankit. So Ankit, all yours.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, the organizer, and for organizing this conference. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I am audible to everyone. And the title of my paper is The Untouchable Problem of Midnight Children. But before we begin talking about this unique, untouchable problem, let me briefly talk about the problem that I myself faced while attempting to write this paper. This conference, Theorising Anticaste, is perhaps the first of its kind where a systematic approach to contemplate, define, and theorize anticasteism is taking place. This tells us that the theoretical anti-casteism is still under its nebulous stage. So when I try to analyze a text from an anti-caste perspective, I'm entering into a new realm itself, where I might not have anything to fall back, not much citation to refer, not an authority to confirm my point of view. For example, the text in consideration, Midnight Children, the epoch-making novel that was first published in 1981, created such a phenomenon that the novel, its author, and the critical study that follow all have a larger than life aspect to it. So it is natural to feel uh, bogged down from the overwhelming amount of scholarship that is available and when one is trying to contain it. But as Dr. Ambedkar said, a man in adopting an aspiration, one need not to be abased or deterred by doubts about one's power to satisfy it. One should be ashamed only of a mean aspiration, not failure, that may result because of one's aspiration is high. Keeping this in mind, let me begin. In one of his many monologues in the Mahmood book Midnight Children, Salim Sinai, the main protagonist, who is bestowed with a superpower to look into the hearts and the minds of a man, casually remark, "The untouchable problem remain acute. I did nothing to alleviate it." Salim as a character is also closest to being the spokesperson of Salman Rushdie in the novel. And it is not surprising that talking about Midnight Children in his famous essay, Errata or Unreliable Narration in Midnight Children, Rushdie echoes a similar attitude of brushing off the issue of a caste. He points out that the reader who thought that novel to be incomplete as it did not talk about the plight of Harijan or untouchable, wanted his tale to be a history rather than a novel. But his novel created a history of its own, such that often post-1980 period in Indian English writing is referred to as post-Rushdie. Winning awards after award, Midnight Children put Indian English writing on the international platform and become a quintessential Indian novel. To borrow from what Achibi used to characterize the novel, Achibi in his famous essay, you Midnight Children is now a permanent literature, studied in a university, read and taught and constantly evaluated by serious academics. True to this, Rushdie's capacious and epoch-making novel has been scrutinized in scholarly inquiry as a novel that reflects on postmodernism, magical realism, post-colonialism, historiography, partition, communalism, modernism, and so on, but hardly ever as a novel that comments on a caste, which it does quite ostensibly in my opinion. Employing close textual analysis, I aim to unlock and unhinge Rushdie's text from its close hermeneutical circle and suggest that even if literary texts elude mentioning caste, it generates an opportunity for an anti-caste critique to scrutinize the complex ramification of its absence and study the literary construction of a caste in Indian English writing. Moreover, as the complexity of caste is not new, and its millennial-long history and extensive scholarship on it is a testimonial of its intricate and interminable nature, I argue that the formulation of a caste as an untouchable problem in Rushdie's text is unique and symptomatic of a broader psychological predilection toward forgetfulness when it is about coming to terms with a troubling past. Examining upper caste autobiography (MSS), Pandian wrote that the subtle act of transcoding caste and caste relations into something else is a regular feature one finds in most upper caste biography. Caste always belonged to someone else, it is somewhere else, it is of another time. What Pandian said about upper caste autobiography can be equally applied to Indian English writing. In Indian English writing, the transcoding is done by treating caste as not what it is, a systematic structure perpetuating the worst form of graded inequality that first need to be deconstructed in order to be demolished later, but as an exclusive problem of lower caste, Dalits, untouchable, which has nothing to do with upper caste or upper class, as now they self-fashion themselves as a casteless entities. This is succinctly exemplified in what Salim has said, that untouchable problem remain acute, I did nothing to elevate. Here, it is not the problem of untouchability, and certainly not the actual problem of caste, but not even the untouchables problem that is referred to here. But by missing an apostrophe, Rushdie moved even one step ahead in transcoding caste and made the problem of a caste an untouchable problem in itself, a problem so intricate that it cannot even be touched, and it is best if casteless being, the upper caste and upper class, avoid this problem at all costs. Tabish Khair notes in his essay "Caste in Indian English Fiction: Poor Operation" that, like universalism for Western writers was largely Euro-American values and a stereotype, pan-Indian espoused by Indian English writer is largely an upper caste worldview which has subsided the majority of Indian into castial other. This is most pronounced in the writing of Raja Rao, V.S. Naipaul, Shuddin and Ghosh, etc., where the castial others has been used as a mere plot filler or narrative structuring device. Caste in literary articulation is not just eluded but repressed regularly. Indian English writing is replete with such instances. Interestingly, Rushdie's character Shiva fits the category of a castial other. Shiva appears as an independent, assertive character at first, but after more critical scrutiny, one finds him not more than an ornament to the main protagonist, Salim. And no surprise has to die in the end for the narrative to fully work out. As a character, he is merely a poor Hindu who grew up in slum. His caste is never mentioned and moreover purposely eluded by dropping off his surname and transcoding all the paraphernalia of a caste into an oversimplified class narrative. Shiva is filled with rage from a young age, but his rage is misdirected and misjudged. Being simply poor does not explain his condition and the derision that he has to suffer. It is something more than that when a young impressionistic kid was bullied by other kids who are conditioned by their upper caste and upper class haughtiness. Shiva's father is not only surnameless but nameless. He is merely referred as a Wee Willie throughout the narrative and soon dies from throat cancer. It is again important that minor lower caste characters dies in the narrative from time to time. Shiva is introduced as the rival of a Salim, as an angry young 10-year kid on the street who is ready to cut throat to survive in this world. And he had already broken both wrists of his father once and he tried to botch his knees so that he can have an illustrious career as a packer. Shiva, time to time, has openly challenged Salim's authority over Midnight Children. And in the start, he thought that both of them will jointly rule the Midnight gang. But lower caste character, however self-righteous they appear, cannot become the center of the narrative. Shiva's character is merely patched as a piece of decorator in Rushdie's grand tapestry. Rushdie is not an upper caste Hindu but an upper caste Muslim, Indian British now writer, now American as well, a global being if you may, but still perfectly fits the category of a casteless upper caste. Rushdie though comes from a section that itself can be termed as other, and his Muslim background should have put him outside the Hindu caste structure. But as we know, no South Asian religion is exempt from the virus of caste. The colossal structure of a caste entangled in between lines appear often in Rushdie's narrative. In the Midnight Children conference, there is clearly the ghost of untouchability. When talking about the problem Salim faced while hosting Midnight Children conference, he says that Brahmin begins born the pressure of poverty and communism were becoming evident. But surprisingly, Rushdie in his narrative definitely does not see himself as an obscure other. Instead, he seems to take on the center. It is not that Rushdie is not aware of the problem of caste. But for Salim and Rushdie, the problem of caste always remain an untouchable problem. Uh, Salim again is the closest to this Salman Rushdie as a his spokesperson. And Salim writes that note, despite my Muslim background, I am enough of a Bombayite to be well up in Hindu stories. And when he is compared by Padma to when Padma compares his unwinding tale as a Brahmin talk, Salim could not hide his satisfaction and remarks, born and raised in the Muslim tradition, I find myself overwhelmed all of a sudden by an older learning. There is a proliferation of a lower caste character, and the legitimacy that Rushdie require come from his identification with the subaltern. The lower caste character comes as a plot filler. There are latrine cleaner, rickshawala, servants, slum dwellers, and many other surnameless lower caste characters. There are passages where Rushdie sweepingly describes the major event taking place around the narrative time, but it seems the issue of untouchability never appeared to him important enough to mention or hold his attention. Salim's true inheritance, Shiva's righteous anger, and his symbolic continuation of Midnight Children are what have given the narrative its base. While on the other side, the constant use of the word Bhangi by Rushdie to insinuate a great insult. For example, that Bhangi, that dirty, filthy fellow, not even your nephew, I don't know what's got into you, we should throw him out on his ear, and trumpeting of the same old Hindu mythology to valorize and characterize India makes the text deeply offensive from Dalit's point of view. Many incidents in the novel exemplify how it is always the lower caste who is the first victim of any sort of a violence or hatred, irrespective of a religion. Rushdie's allegory failed to capture the multiculturalism and diversity of India. Instead, it presented the reality as a series of a binary, for example, Hindu, Muslim, rich and poor, literate and illiterate. In doing so, it also created a sort of a template from which most of the Anglo fiction finds its inspiration. To briefly talk about the character of Salim, Salim is the illegitimate son of a Britisher, Method, and a lower caste woman, Vanita. And he grew up in a Muslim household, which is referred as a Buckingham villa for the most of the time. He studied in a Catholic school where English and European custom rule, and Salim's father longs for a fictional ancestor and desire to belong to Mughals. Salim is the meta-narrative in the meta-narrative of the novel become a crude metaphor of a lower caste conversion to Islam and brushing incident with the colonialism. But later it is only the religious identity that dominates, and it's the usher of culture that seems to demarcate him. And we see Rushdie doesn't otherize himself in the character of Salim. Instead, he gives power to himself to otherize Shiva, the lower caste Hindu. It is interesting to see that while in Midnight Children, caste is subtly eluded by deliberately withholding the surname of character. In the work of emerging Dalit English writers, caste gets rendered explicitly commenting on the surname. When it comes to surname, an irrefutable caste marker in the Indian context, many have launched the radical act of naming and dropping upper caste surname. For example, Yashika in her memoir Coming Out as Dalit, which won Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar for 2020, talks about her childhood experience. I did not even know I was a Bhangi, but I knew it was something I and not anyone else should be embarrassed about. Her family hid under an upper caste surname to escape the shame associated with identity as a Bhangi. This shame about caste continued even in convent education, urban spaces, and elite colleges, for example, St. Stephen. And not even her flawless English language, which was supposed to put her on the same level as her classmate, could cover the carcass of her hidden caste identity. Tragically, as she explained in her book, the first time she read something written by Dalit in English was the last letter of Rohit Vemula. This hiding of one's identity and emulating upper caste is what M. N. Srinivasan called Sanskritization or Brahmanization. But through her memoir, Yashika de-Brahmanizes herself, learning that her history is one of oppression, not shame, and comes to terms with her identity. The coming of this writer to the English literary landscape is a dent in the citadel of a castelessness, which has been carefully guarded by Dutch master, who assume that it is Shudra or Ati Shudra who carry caste, an untouchable problem, with themselves. Young Dalit writers are aware of injunction laid against their forefather in speaking English. Earlier it was Sanskrit, therefore consciously choose to speak and write in English. And they have launched the radical act to name names and surnames. Coming back to Rushdie seems like a conformist writer to know that Hindu mythology has to be used in the narrative unless the narrative won't succeed. The attitude of Rushdie in Midnight Children is more of respect toward Hindu mythology and slight derision toward even Islamic mythology. Rushdie put layers between his character and his real life personality, and this fictional attire that he imagines to be able to perform the role of a spokesperson of and it appropriate the role of a spokesperson for the native. Rushdie trying to put himself in the great arc of an Indian narrative where Hindu-Muslim binary mattered most and ignores the multiplicity of Indian context. For example, the Hindu-Muslim right, the post-partition right was such a complicated matter, and the mainstream narrative are woefully ignorant of its caste politics. It is hardly surprising that Rushdie, who is badly infected with his desire to encompass the whole history of India, misses everything. To conclude whether a literary text elide to mention caste or forcefully mention it numerous times, it generates an opportunity for an anti-caste critique to scrutinize the complex ramification of the absence or presence of a caste in particular context. Midnight Children, when contextualized with caste, appear as a mere tale hanging on a stereotype and a general liberal understanding. Like in Salim and Rushdie, many post-colonial critiques have done nothing to address the structural problem of a caste. In India, caste is a complex, while class communalism and colonialism offer relative simplicity. And like many other so-called intellectuals, Rushdie could not handle the complexity. Rushdie, more than any other writer, being a Muslim, inhabits the hollow of secular writers who see caste as an untouchable problem. Thank you. That will be all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankit. You've maintained the time perfectly. And you make a very important point about how Rushdie conflates caste and class. A more detailed discussion of your paper, throwing it open to questions and comments, will occur at the end of the session, as I said. So thank you indeed for your paper. We pass on to the second paper in the session, and the paper presenter is Preetha Mukherjee. Is Preetha here?
Ma'am, Preetha Mukherjee is not present today.
Okay. She didn't really send any message, so we are assuming, and if she joins later, maybe we will include her at the end. So
Yes,
since
sure.
she's not here, I mean, the way the entire session was planned, I think was very intelligent in the sense that we had two novels written in the English language, and then the two following papers were novels that were written in the vernacular, right? So it was a nice balance of Indian writing in the vernacular and English, but unfortunately we don't have Preetha present. She was supposed to talk about the God of Small Things. So without wasting time, we shall pass on to what was meant to be the third paper in the panel, which is by Anjali Das. Is Anjali here? Yes. Okay. Anjali Das is a PhD scholar, research scholar in the Department of English, Patna University. Her topic of research is Poetics of the Marginalized, reading the aesthetics of Dalit poetry. She has done her graduation and post-graduation from the University of Delhi. Her MPhil too is from the University of Delhi, and the topic was the aesthetics of Dalit literature. Today she is going to speak about a very, very important aspect, understanding caste, identity and occupation, an exploration of the aesthetics of Dalit trauma as manual scavengers. So, Anjali, please begin your presentation. Anjali, at least I can't hear you.
You are muted, Anjali.
Sorry. Thank you, ma'am, for the introduction. First of all, I apologize because of my bad health. I have a bad throat since yesterday and fever. So since then, also I'll try to manage and say. Um, okay. My topic is understanding caste, identity, and occupation, and exploration of the aesthetics of Dalit trauma as manual scavengers. Caste system is a centuries old concept that has been forced on the marginalized to suit the distinctive mentalities of the authorities at the center. Its discrimination based on descent and occupation results in the segregation of communities, including the stigmatization of some of these communities as untouchables, making them highly vulnerable to the most barbaric forms of social, physical, psychological violence, such as the occupation of manual scavenging. This form of exploitation further leads to the trauma that these segregated communities face because of the institution of caste and its dehumanizing effect to which Dalits are subjected to. Untouchability and social isolation are intrinsically related to manual scavenging. Manual scavenging has historically been linked to caste in Indian subcontinent. The Brahminical social order assigns the most polluting tasks such as removing human excreta and cleaning of severages to Dalits. Among the marginalized sections, communities that exist on the extreme margins, subcastes of Dalit and scheduled castes who are involved in manual scavenging, sewerage and septic tank cleaning, garbage and animal carcass removal and cleaning are the most vulnerable peoples. Manual scavengers who fall in the last rungs of social hierarchy, even amongst the Dalits, experience discrimination and systematic deprivation. These communities continue to face structural barriers of social exclusion, caste based discrimination, untouchability, financial vulnerability, extreme health hazards, and untimely death due to involvement in this type of menial work, despite the fact that manual scavenging has been outlawed under different legislations in India. Manual scavenging has been enforced as a traditionally hereditary caste-based occupation on a specific group of people belonging to the Dalit communities who are known differently in different regions. For example, they are called Bhangi, Chura, Halalkhor, Jamadar, Lal Begi and Mehtar in northern India, and in the south they are called Chakiliya, Matiga and Thoti. Gandhi, who believed in Chaturvarna and his division of labor, equated the cleaning of excreta to a mother cleaning her son's shit. He portrayed scavenging as dignified work, deifying the occupation. He used to say, I'm quoting, I'm not ashamed to call myself a manual scavenger, and asked every manual scavenger that he should not feel ashamed of being called the same. To him, this society is based on many services. A scavenger is at the base of every service. On the other hand, Ambedkar says, how sacred is this work of cleanliness? That work can be done by a Brahmin or by a Bhangi. The Brahmin may do it in his wisdom, the Bhangi in ignorance. If either of the two disappeared from Hinduism, Hinduism itself would disappear. Ambedkar considered, as contrary to Gandhi, manual scavenging to be a symbol of slavery and advocated for its eradication. Please excuse me. Dr. Ambedkar explains, underquotes, in India, a man is not a scavenger because of his work. He is a scavenger because of his birth, irrespective of the question whether he does scavenging or not. Unquote. The status of Bhangis as manual scavengers was a serious point of debate and difference between Gandhi and Ambedkar. While Gandhi believed in manual scavenging as the basis of every service and even suggested specific educational and practical qualities for an ideal Bhangi, Ambedkar severely criticized such attempts to link a degrading practice with ideals of service, calling it a cruel joke played on helpless people belonging to this caste. These communities end up doing manual scavenger work as they hardly have any other alternative employment and have little access to health and medical care. In an interview by Outlook, one of the manual scavengers says, "We have seen our parents doing this in the villages where we grew up. If they did not want to do it, they were threatened with being denied access to community land and resources, often with the support of village councils and other officials. We came to cities hoping to lead a better life, but destiny led me to where I belong," said a 30-year-old Kulbir, a manual scavenger who lives in Ghaziabad, among other people engaged in this profession. Uh, Now I'll go to the second part of my presentation, which is the representation of manual scavenging in literature. Mulkraj Anand's Untouchable is considered the first text that has dealt with the scavenger's occupation and having a sweeper as its protagonist. The novel, however, is not radical in its approach to the problems of scavengers. Bakha, the protagonist, is portrayed as so submissive towards the marginalization that he does not have the agency to raise his voice against the exploitative system of caste. Bakha does not seek a solution to untouchability in realistic terms. Both the character of Bakha and his father Lakha internalize the system of caste and accept suffering but do not dream of protesting against social injustice and exploitation. The centuries of servility have paralyzed their senses to retaliate and leave the occupation of cleaning and manual labor. Unlike the character of Jay, the graduating Baburao Bagul's short story, Revolt. Bagul's character Jay ravages against the established norms of the society which deprives Dalits of recognition as mere human beings. For Baburao Bagul, Dalit is a hero of the modern world, and he uses literature as a medium to show the unreasonable tactics employed by the social system which left those heroes unrecognized. Stories like Revolt and When I Hid My Caste narrates how educated lower caste men who nurture desires of revolting against caste are rendered helpless due to their lower caste status. Jay, who is a graduate in the short story Revolt, was forced to continue manual scavenging, which was his caste occupation. His most poignant story tells the Baburao Bagul's most poignant story tells the story of an educated Dalit trying to escape his caste profession of scavenging, which is simultaneously an ethnography of caste oppression. The character Jay asks his father, "Where is it written that a Bhangi's son must become a Bhangi?" The father responds, "In our poverty, in our dharma, in our country." The Varna ideology of inequality, superimposed over the existing jatis by the Brahminic Hinduism based on religious justification, forced him to exceed superiority to the Brahmins. As B.R. Ambedkar explains, underquote, "The root of untouchability is caste system. The root of the caste system is religion attached to Varna and Ashram, and the root of Varnashram is Brahmanical religion, and the root of Brahmanical religion is authoritarianism or political power. Untouchability is only as extended form of caste, and therefore, without abolition of caste, there is no hope of abolition of untouchability." Unquote. Revolt reflects a youth Jay who was influenced by Ambedkar's ideology, opposes his parents' effort to make him work as a manual scavenger cleaner. Jay is adamant about his decision and wants to finish his education, but his father remains skeptical of his son's education and wants to dispel the white collar dream his son had been nurturing. Ambedkar believed that through education only this age-old system of caste can be removed. He was of the opinion that, I quote, Ambedkar says, "I firmly believe in the efficacy of education as a panacea for our social evils. The problem of lower order in this country is not only economic but also cultural. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate with each other. We have lost the ability to communicate It is not enough to house them, feed them, and then to leave them to serve the higher classes, as was the ancient ideal of this country. It is even more necessary to remove from them that feeling of inferiority which was stunted their growth and made them slaves of others, and to create in them a consciousness of significances of life for themselves and for their country, of which they have been cruelly robbed by the achieve this, except as threat of higher education. Unquote. Jay does not give in. He goes on to ask his father, what dharma, if it breaks a person, excuse me, if it breaks a person and turns him into an animal, is that dharma? In this country that invests greater significance in a stone than in a human being, I will not heed such a dharma. If it has given us this poverty, this deprivation, then it behoves us to reject it. When Kashinath also, in When I Hid My Caste, asserts his defiance against the birth-based occupation given to him. He shouts in rage, I am a Mahar, but that does not mean I'm going to clean human shit and piss from the walls. As B.R. Ambedkar acknowledges, ours is a battle not for wealth or for power. It is a battle for freedom. It is a battle for the reclamation of human personality. Both the characters which Babura Bagul has represented in his two short stories envisage a future in which they get rid of their pain. They have a strong ambition to break away from the clutches of caste through education. Ambedkar's clarion call to educate, agitate, and organize echoes when Jay argues with his father, saying, just for this, I should become a bhangi, give up my education to clear up the dirt of the village, carry filth on my head. If you wanted me to do that kind of work, why did you have me educated? Why did you let them light these lamps of independence, knowledge, and humanity inside my mind? Again, the story demands comparison with Mulkraj Anand's Untouchable here, whose protagonist Bakha lacks this iconoclastic zeal displayed by Jay in the story to revolt against this age-old system of untouchability. Another short novel by T. Shiv Sankara Pillai, Scavenger's Son, originally published in 1948, also details the plight of manual scavengers, particularly their social status and deplorable working conditions. The novel also underlines the root of communist politics in post-independence Kerala. It has been decades since this novel was written, but it was still relevant today because uh, still relevant today, and it shows how literature transits time and geography, as scavenging is still prevalent today in our country. Scavenger's Son can be seen as a political novel about the awakening of the untouchable community under the influence of revolutionary ideas. Churala Muttu, the central character, becomes a scavenger after his father dies of starvation. His father had been a scavenger for 30 years. Though Churala Muttu reconciles himself to his fate, he secretly dreams of owning a house, raising a family, and sending his children to school. His search for a secure life makes him excessively cautious and miserly. The story depicts gross reality of the life of the untouchables and portrays the inhuman situation of the untouchables which they have been forced into because of manual scavenging. The desire is not merely to build a respectable house, but a desire of having a self-esteemed life and having an identity away from the occupation of scavenging, which can give them a respectable life. The characters of Jay and Chudalamuttu represents the discursive marginal identity of the peoples engaged in the profession of manual labor. It is not an individual identity, but it represents the cultural status of marginalized Dalits trauma collectively. The other novel, Bhasha Singh's book Unseen. Uh, Bhasha Singh's book Unseen, The Truth About India's Manual Scavengers, is another contemporary text that awakens the reader to a world of a powerless community of manual scavenging. In a testimony of a boy who began manual scavenging at the age of 17, he says, With tears in his eyes and a cracking voice, he recounted how, when he first picked up the bucket and cleaned a dry latrine, all he could see were books in front of his eyes. He has eyes, and his head began to spin. The book untravels the exploitative nature of the deep-rooted caste system and the ineffectiveness of legislative, executive, and judiciary machinery that are ignorant in the making of policy for the welfare of the so-called untouchables. Singh has documented the testimonies of the manual scavengers by traveling across the Indian states and tries to portray the relegating pain and experiences of the people involved in this occupation. To substantiate her critical lens towards the socio-political structure and institutions sustaining this inhuman practice, Singh has presented compelling arguments and evidences from government reports, political statements, testimonies from the scavengers as well as members of NGOs like the Safai Karamchari Abhiyan and Garima Abhiyan, and her own chilling experiences as manual scavenger journalist. She has dealt with the most basic questions at the root of his practice, like why don't people leave this work, or why, despite it being illegal, have governments allowed this practice to continue? Narrating the pangs of discrimination faced by these women in domestic and public spaces, the treatment of Valmiki children as untouchables, and forcing them to clean toilets in schools or sit at the back of the class. Bhasha Singh has also reflected on how the terminology such as Tabbu Wali, Balti Wali, Tina Bali, Tokri Wali was used for these women represent that their individual identities have been subsumed by a caste identity recognized as the untouchable of the society. She has portrayed the real side of the scavenging community by giving a glimpse of the stories of female manual scavengers rising as local Dalit leaders. However, Bhasha Singh writes that their representation is yet to find a voice in the upper rungs of politics. Along with representing these struggles, the author has tried to document the different strategies of protests employed by this community and other civil society initiatives. For instance, the Independence Day March by manual scavengers, marking the Manual Scavengers Day in Gujarat. Singh has further criticized the employment of manual scavengers and construction of dry latrines Prohibition Act 1993 for its inherently flawed provisions that practically give away to propelling rather than eradicating this practice. While caste stigma has kept them out of alternative professions, the government assistance in terms of loans has been viewed as flawed because these people who were branded as untouchables do not find any other source for their livelihood because of their previous profession as a manual scavenger. Vindeshwar Pathak, in his text Road to Freedom, a sociological study on the abolition of scavenging in India, has also traced the existence of scavenger and the system for disposal of night soil through Hindu texts and sums up. Scavenging has been existing in India for a long period, and the persons engaged in cleaning, carrying, and disposing of night soil have been known as scavengers or bhangis. This subcaste or occupational group was placed at the lowest level and was labeled as untouchable in the traditional social system. These scavengers were not included in the caste system; rather, they were treated as the polluted outcast because they cleaned night soil and sewages. They were not allowed to touch the high caste people, and hence all types of social interactions were forbidden for these subcaste scavengers. The demeaning and subhuman occupation of scavenging was their fate under the traditional system, and they were not permitted to take up any other job according to their killings, merits, and capabilities. According to their likings, merits, and capabilities. Bhasha Singh has also thrown light on the gaps in the country's sanitation infrastructure from areas still without sewers and poverty-stricken localities with dry latrines to the lagging installation of bio-toilets in Indian railways. The affirmative and protective measures that are being offered to the Dalit as a solution to their misery are totally misconceptional, and it can be seen through the pieces of evidence presented by Bhasha Singh in the form of survey reports, research data, and the lack of intervention to provide alternative solutions clearly shows that these laws are yet to be fully implemented due to the lack of political will. The Human Rights Watch report 1999 clearly states untouchability was abolished under India's constitution in 1950. Yet, entire villages in Indian states remain completely segregated by caste in what has been called hidden apartheid. Untouchables or Dalits, the name literally means broken people, may not enter the high caste section of villages, may not use the same bells, wear shoes in the presence of upper castes, visit the same temple, drink from the same cups in tea stalls, or lay claim to land that is legally theirs. Dalit children are frequently made to sit in the back of classrooms. Dalit villagers have been the victims of many brutal massacres in recent years. Untouchability is not an ancient cultural artifact, it is human rights abuse. Even this country Even in this country, close to a million Dalits are forced to engage in manual scavenging for their survival in Indian states. Different Dalit struggles are still on the state, national and international levels for their basic human rights and for the effective implementation of the policies meant for their promotion and for the strict enforcement of the legislation meant for their protection. That is all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. I saw you struggling with your bad throat. You have my heartfelt sympathies. As someone with a chronically bad throat, my students will testify to it. I know you're struggling. Yes, your paper highlighted a very, very important topic, the very inhuman sort of practice of manual scavenging, which makes the manual scavenger perhaps the worst oppressed in the Dalit sort of hierarchy. And merely banning it by law doesn't really eliminate the practice, like dowry has been banned theoretically by passing a law, but it still exists and crimes associated with dowry still exist. So yes, thank you for highlighting both the fiction and non-fiction around this important topic.
Thank
Our
you.
next speaker is going to be Abhinav Piyush. He is an assistant professor at the Tagore Government Arts and Science College, Puducherry. He is also pursuing his PhD in the Department of English, University of Delhi. He is going to speak on an area, it has a long title, so I'll just read it out. Defining the terrain of the novel of Dalit consciousness in Jai Prakash Kardam's Chappar, which is Thatched Roof, a study of Hindi Dalit literary counterculture. So, Abhinav, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible to everyone. Uh, thank, thank you so much for the introduction, Professor Shanta Dutta. A very good afternoon to my fellow presenters and students. Uh, now, as the chair has already mentioned that this um, uh, I'll introduce my paper in the sense that it happens to be a part of my larger project that is to map the emergence of Hindi Dalit fiction both in the short format as well as in the longer form, especially in the context of the post-Mandal caste activated public sphere in northern India. Now, there are certain thematic undercurrents which run throughout the project, but this particular paper, which deals with Jayaprakash Kardam's first novel, not first novel, but the first novel of Dalit consciousness, so to speak, Dalit Chetna, uh, that novel happens to be a departure point in the study of the longer format of the Hindi Dalit novel, and I'll try to. It's a textual study, but at the same point of time, it also uh, goes on to throw some light on Hindi Dalit literary counterculture, and perhaps should give you an understanding in terms of how the Hindi Dalit fiction it emerges in the post-Mandal era, and even though as an almost as an afterthought, given that Marathi Dalit writings and Tamil Dalit writings, Telugu Dalit writings by then had all occupied prominent spaces. In fact, Professor Tapan Basu at Delhi University, he goes on to argue that even now it's been more than 20, 30 years that Hindi Dalit writers have made their mark, have published, have come up with critical writings. But at the same point of time, in the public sphere, their positions are still very, very marginalized, very little spoken about. And my attempt is to bring some light there. Okay, I'll begin. The title of my paper is Jayaprakash Kardam's Chappar, which is a novel published in 1994, and I see it as a novel of Dalit Chetana, almost as a prototype, and where he goes on to define the terrain of what Dalit Chetana is all about, and how this results in the growth of Hindi Dalit literary counterculture. I'll begin. The sudden spurt in Hindi Dalit novels in the 1990s is seen as an immediate consequence of the formation of the Dalit middle class. Inspired by the Marathi Dalit literature and the anti-caste movements elsewhere in India, and as the beneficiaries of the reservation policies in public education and employment, a group of well-educated and employed individuals who represent the emergence of Dalit middle class in select North Indian cities visualize identity assertion through literature as a means to contest the social and political marginalization in Hindi region. Simultaneously, in spite of the assertion of Dalit identity in the form of what Sudha Pai calls as the social deepening of democracy, the welfare state and its democratic institutions were largely dictated by the electoral politics of the non-Dalits. Hindi Dalit literature in general, and the Hindi Dalit novel in particular, increasingly showcases a very nuanced understanding of such caste-based social and political contrasts and conflicts in the Hindi public sphere, as compared to these sporadic fictional works that were published earlier. Contemporary Hindi Dalit novel politically positions itself in the aesthetics of resistance and identity assertion, while remaining cognizant of the larger Dalit movement and Dalit politics. Ambedkarite ideas of justice, rights, and equality, which are constituted into a political framework of Dalit consciousness, are reworked in these works of fiction through a distinct literary positioning. It is to be noted that the representational politics of the self and the community that the Dalit autobiographies from different regional literary cultures establish is not abandoned, but it is improvised upon. It becomes obvious that these writers realize the political and literary potential of the Dalit experiential as they seek to mold the polyphonic world of a novel with the authenticity of the Dalit experience, and in the process create the literary foundations of Hindi Dalit novel. In the post-Mandal era, this new middle class of writers began to employ Dalit identity as a literary operative, Dalit or Ambedkarite Chetana as a critical and conceptual framework, and also participated in caste-activated social and political sphere as community intellectuals. Almost as a literary and historical rupture, it is with the publication of Jayaprakash Kardam's novel Chappar in 1994, eminent Hindi Dalit critic N. Singh argues that the first novel of Dalit consciousness arrives in Hindi. Hindi women Dalit writer Sushila Tagore also cites Chappar as the first Dalit novel in Hindi, as it epitomizes the quest for Dalit aesthetics. This kind of critical consensus in the Hindi Dalit literary sphere around the world warrants us to examine Kardam's genre-defining politics of representation. In this paper, I attempt to read this early Hindi Dalit novel by Jayaprakash Kardam as the textual repository of Dalit consciousness, which largely defines the terrain of the Hindi novel written in 1990s and later. Significantly, rather than simply underlying the significance of the genre, Kardam's voice as a scholar and critic also helps us understand how he places the novel within the larger tradition of Hindi Dalit writings. He elaborates on this conscious political position of the Dalit writer when he states that Dalit literature, I quote, is a part of Dalit movement. It is a weapon against exploitation and oppression. The primary purpose of Dalit literature is to create self-respect and pride in the Dalit community. Unquote. Kardam is cognizant of the literary and political responsibility that the Dalit writer undertakes. For the first generation writers like Kardam, who were writing in the immediate reality of the post-Mandal politics, and as a part of the new generation of educated and employed lower middle class community intellectuals, the radical redefinition of literature, that is from eraser to assertion, came from a very conscious act of configuring a literary aesthetics of Dalit Chetana with its origins in the self and the ideas of Ambedkar. In an interview with Nilanshu Agrawal, Kadam elaborates on on the ideological nuances that distinguish Dalit literature written by a Dalit writer and the literature written by a non-Dalit writer, as relevant in the context of many other Hindi Dalit writers who are contesting and defining the politics of representation within both Hindi Dalit literature and the mainstream Hindi literature. Kardam highlights the centrality of Dalit experiential in the Dalit literature. He states, I quote, Dalits have specific experiences of life which non-Dalits do not have. Only Dalit writers can express their experiences in an authentic manner, but not others. Non-Dalit writers may be sympathetic to Dalits. They may be their well-wishers, but their experiences about Dalits are not their self-experiences. They are the observers of torture and exploitation of Dalits. They have not suffered. This difference of experiences between Dalits and non-Dalits makes the difference between the writings of Dalits and non-Dalits. Unquote. Thus, Kardam clearly makes a disjunction between the self-experience and the sympathetic understanding of Dalit experience, what is known as the Anubhuti and Swanubhuti debate in the Hindi Dalit literature. In treating the experiential as the epistemic basis, Kardam aligns himself with the tradition of these self-writings in Dalit literature. There is a special emphasis on authenticity of the depicted experience as conveyed by the self-writings. Kardam also consciously positioned himself against several Hindi critics who questioned the literary merit of the excessively political Dalit novel and often advocate non-Dalit novels on Dalit experiences to be included in the fold of Dalit literature. This rejection of the non-Dalit writings can be seen as a part of the collective rejection of the sympathetic and reformist discourse of caste by Dalit writers who even question the representational politics of Premchand. In turn, this also settles the question of Dalit Chetana as the sole preserve of Dalit writers. This consciousness is born in Dalit experiential and Dalit subjects' exposure and familiarity with the Ambedkarite thought. Laura Voigt contends that Dalit consciousness is elemental in opposing the cultural inheritance of the upper caste, the notion that culture is a hereditary right for them and one that is denied to Dalits. She cites Om Prakash Valmiki, who suggests Dalit consciousness is deeply concerned with the questions such as who am I, what is my identity. The strength of the character of Dalit authors comes from such questions. Thus, in Valmiki's sense of the term, Dalit consciousness is what gives Dalit literature its unique power. Born in 1958 in Ghaziabad district of Western Uttar Pradesh, Jayaprakash Kadam belongs to the pioneering generation of Hindi Dalit writers who helped in shaping its discursive foundation. Kadam has postgraduate degrees in 3 disciplines as well as a doctoral degree. He worked as a gazetted government employee in the capacity of a Hindi officer and is presently based in Delhi. Kardam's contributions in the genres of poetry and short stories have been quite noticeable, with the publication of Talash and Gunga Nahi Tha Main and Tinka Tinka Aag. Like many of his contemporaries, Kardam's critical writings also engaged with the discursive space of Hindi Dalit literature and strengthened its literary, sociological, as well as political discourses. His writings can be primarily divided into two anti-caste intellectual positions which provide clarity into the journey as a writer. Kardam, like several other early generation Hindi Dalit writers, did not begin as an Ambedkarite. Dalit writings which primarily incorporate Ambedkarite ideas and Buddhist writings which offer limited anti-caste consciousness constitute two different strands of his literary politics. As his first attempt at writing a novel, Jayaprakash Kardam published a novel called Karuna, Compassion in 1986, which belonged to the Buddhist tradition of writing with limited caste critique. This novella is centered on the compulsory sterilization program for population control implemented during the tenure of Indira Gandhi. In the foreword to the third edition of the novel, Kardam clarifies that this novel deals with the ideals of Buddhism. Even the central protagonist of the novel is a female Buddhist monk. It is to be noted that in the two-page foreword, Kardam does not mention a word about Dalit literature or Dalit belonging, which even reflects his unfamiliarity with the Ambedkarite movement or ideas at that time. Although the novel contains references to caste-based exploitations in a feudal setting, it chooses to color it as a social evils uh, which are to be resolved within the ideals of Buddhist belonging. It is with the publication of Chappar that Kardam aligns his works with the literary aesthetics of Dalit Chetna. Chappar is an intergenerational tale of Dalit experience in the feudal hinterlands of Uttar Pradesh. The novel begins with the description of rural spatiality of Matapur and the entrenched specifics of caste segregated quarters of the village. The detailed cultural, social, and economic description of the village almost happens on the lines of Fanishwar Nath Renu's representative work Mela Anchal, where he invented the Anchalik Sahitya, that is the regional novel, by carefully dispensing the realistic social and cultural details of the people and hinterlands of Bihar. Having discussed the caste-based agrarian economy of the village, Kadam introduces to the reader the destitute conditions of Sukha and Ramya, who live under a thatched roof, in a complete contrast with the house of upper caste, which conveyed abundance and prosperity. The social disparity between the upper caste households and the Dalit habitations is fairly well laid out at the beginning of the novel. Despite their impoverished conditions, the first chapter also prepares the terrain for an Ambedkarite intervention by injecting the narrative of education of their son. A diseased Sukha and a decrepit Ramya are found to discuss the emancipatory aspect of education and employment which would be enabling for their son Chandan. Even what can be seen as an embodiment of Ambedkarite rationality and radicalism, Sukha points out that the possibility of social mobility and financial security which education alone can bring to the Dalit individual. He counters Ramya, who represents a more conservative thought process. Keep quiet, woman, I quote. Does someone's superiority get stamped in the womb itself? Education is the only way. Who knows, our Chandan might as well become a collector or an inspector. Don't worry, happiness is bound to come after all these years of depravity. We will also get to experience good days. Here, in the light of emblematic furthering of Ambedkarite ideas in Hindi Dalit literature, education is projected as the great equalizing force with social oppression and disparity. In the wake of the renewed debates around reservation in education and employment promulgated under the Mandal Commission recommendations, the Dalit community is evidently more conscious and mobilized to avail these state-sponsored reservations for socio-economic parity. Kardam's furthering of the Dalit middle class's understanding of the constitutionally mandated welfare measures, which has allowed Dalit families to transcend their socio-economic condition, is evident here. It is this aspirational middle class belonging that offers liberatory possibilities to the Dalit community in the early Hindi Dalit fiction. It is to be noted that Sukha does not approach the idea of education from an essentially middle class point of view. He is more concerned about Chandan falling victim to the entrenched structures of caste oppression in the village, which enforce animal like menial labor and serfdom for the Dalits. In the narratives, Sukha is shown to suffer in order to financially support Chandan's education. The quest for education does not get unchallenged in the narrative. Sukha has to make economic concessions against a social hierarchy that sought to continue to deny access to education to the Dalit individual. The feudal overlords of the village, Thakur Harnam Singh and Kande Pandit, rebuke him and formally ostracize him in the village panchayat for sending his son to the city for higher education. Sukha's transgressive attempt to seek emancipation from the fixity of caste roles for his son translates into his banishment from the rural economy. Sukha, even though uneducated and unemployed, can be seen as a conscious Dalit who does not want to make peace with his fate by rejecting the elements of modernity. In a similar situation, in Mulkaraj Anand's novel Untouchable, which does not exemplify Ambedkarite Chetna, Lakha discourages Baka to gain education and thereby helps in internalizing the inferior status of the caste system that has been imposed on them. On the other hand, Kardam Sukha unconsciously subverts the whole concept of Varna here, where hierarchy is established by birth rather than individual worth. Sukha is able to partially critique the Hindu Varna system and fixity of rules it imposes, thus giving an impetus to individual worth and rationality. He can visualize that only education can be translated into visible socio-economic and political power when he talks about his son being a collector or an inspector. This narrative possibility can become a real social possibility only in the post Ambedkar period, where state sanctioned welfare measures have benefited Dalit individuals. The narrative comes at parallel. The narrative moves at parallel planes in the village and the city. It is the city where Chandan's journey as an ideal Dalit protagonist has been charted. Though Gajrawala argues that the Dalit critic often functions by highlighting the problem of characters where these characters are dehumanized and have been improperly represented in upper caste fiction. In Hindi Dalit novels, these Dalit characters are celebrated and idealized because of their critical consciousness and radicalized thought. Kardam's protagonist Chandan is mobilized by Dalit Chetna. As a first generation migrant to the city, he had idealized the anonymous and promising spaces of the city as compared to the rigidity and stagnancy of Dalit lives in Matapur. However, when he discovers the class intersectionalities of the urban life, the illusory understanding of the city as a post caste paradise is broken. The city is no longer represented as a promising space without qualifications. Kardam's deliberate use of JJ Colony as a working class habitation where Chandan gets to live in the narrative is reflective of the inhuman conditions that Dalits and urban poor in major urban centers have to reside in. It is best exemplified in Haria, who offers free accommodation to Chandan. Haria and others in Santnagar JJ Colony have been at the receiving ends of the oppressive structures of both caste and class. He had to witness the rape of his daughter in the village and is physically assaulted by the culprits as well as the police. However, unlike Chandan, Haria belongs to a pre-Ambedkarite moment when the articulations of atrocities and poverty in the vocabulary of social and economic justice is simply not possible. Even the lower middle class belonging remains elusive for the majority of Dalits, despite the governmental and constitutional measures. Kardam never dehumanizes his Dalit characters in spite of their limitations. Haria, in his inability to withstand systematic exploitation, is portrayed as an alcohol addict, but he dearly loves Chandan as a father and takes care of his daily needs. This kind of idealism in the portrayal of the Dalit characters pervades throughout the narrative. Thus, Dalit consciousness is not just to be seen as a political position, it is also a moral position. In his first Ambedkarite novel, Kardam continues to caricature the ideal male protagonist in Chandan. In a proposed Yagya episode in the novel, Chandan's radicalism to even question the religious belonging gets highlighted. He notices the ignorance and superstition embedded in the proposed Yagya ritual for rain, and he explains to them how rain is determined by the movement of the monsoon winds and not by the mythological accounts. After confronting their orthodox beliefs, Chandan further exposes the interrelationship between caste and religion. The epiphanic moment comes when Chandan explains to them the religious sanctity that is provided to the unequal caste system. It is the caste system that also determines their class belonging. Systematic exploitation has its roots in very religion they believe in. Chandan's transformation does not end here. He is able to mobilize the Dalit population in the city as well as the village. Chandan, as the ideal Dalit male protagonist, is not allowed a self outside the community. Kardam makes him perform the role of a community mentor and political leader while effacing himself. Chandan does not pursue financial security or social mobility, but in an Ambedkarite and anti-caste revolutionary mode, he performs the task of grassroots awakening and mobilization by making Dalits aware of systematic caste oppressions and the available means of emancipation. He begins a school for the Dalit children in Santnagar, and along with his college friends, he is shown to discuss the social, economic, and political marginalizations of Dalit. He vows to raise an army of awakened Dalits and achieves a significant degree of success in his role as a social activist. Kardam's realistic account of Matapur's rural economy portrays the challenges in such cases, where education is not just seen as transformative but also transgressive on the part of the upper caste members symbolized in the novel by the Brahmin Thakur Association for protecting the caste hegemony. The fact that Sukha is forced to abandon his Chappar house and land and migrate from his village to the nearby town to earn a living as a wage laborer also highlights the atrocities that await any attempt of identity assertion by Dalits in such feudal economies. In this kind of narrative, which combines Ambedkarite consciousness with realistic representation, the resolution of the plot, surprisingly, comes from a Gandhian ideals of mutuality, interdependence, and change of heart. Kardam provides a conciliatory end to the novel where Hanam Singh melodramatically relinquishes his title, his land, caste affiliation once Sukha saves him from the attempted suicide. Remorseful, Harnam Singh wants to end his life, but once he realizes the extent of injustices committed by him, finally he becomes Harnam and thus symbolically disposing his caste privileges. This embedded Gandhian narrative of reformation of the upper caste characters that often takes place in the early Hindi Dalit novels has been questioned by many Hindi Dalit critics. Sushila Tagore terms it as a limitation of such works, where Ambedkarite radicalism is compromised to accommodate the reformation of the upper caste characters. Even the Lagan, the agricultural rent on Sukha's land is paid, and his land and Chappar house are returned by Thakur Harnam Singh's daughter Rajni, who sees it as an act of moral compensation for the historical acts of oppression by her forefathers. In Chandan's absence, it is Rajni who looks after his parents. Additionally, it is in the treatment of Dalit women characters that the inadequacies of Kardam's vision stand exposed. Laura Bruick, she cites Anita Bhati, who challenges the Dalit consciousness. Who challenges that Dalit consciousness as it has thus far been defined and applied to literature occludes the feminist consciousness of the Dalit women. In the novel, Ramya, Chandan's mother, is depicted as a conservative voice who never illustrates any potential for a radical questioning of caste or gender based roles. She remains Sukha's constant companion. Dagbhore, a Hindi Dalit woman writer, questions the sidelining of Kamla, another Dalit woman character, as Chandan's companion in the Dalit movement. Kamla, Hariyar's daughter and a single mother who was sexually brutalized as a child, is never considered as the Dalit female protagonist of the novel. In fact, it is Rajni who symbolizes the progressive reformist politics of the upper caste that is depicted as a suitable companion for Chandan. Kamla, on the other hand, is conveniently sacrificed in the narrative in order to save Chandan. Kardam's inability to reinvent Kamla's character and caricaturing her as a perpetual victim shows the limitations of his vision. It is these missing narrative insights that later are revisited by Dalit women authors. In later texts by Dalit women authors, as Laura Bruick argues, the notion of Dalit consciousness as a rhetorical that attempts to assimilate their identities. Dalit women are claimed by both Dalit and feminist movements across India, each often demanding to de emphasize one aspect of their identity, gender, or caste. However, such complications are clearly absent in the generation of Hindi Dalit writers that Kardam represents. Additionally, Chappar also remains a Chamar caste centric novel, and the plurality of Dalit identity is never dealt with by Kardam. Novel's over reliance on the binaries of Dalit and Savarna makes it impervious to the plurality of Dalit belonging. Dalit subcaste identities in their plurality, like the questions of Dalit women, is only explored by the later Hindi Dalit novels. Similarly, middle class aspirations, the experiences of migration, the urban and educated Dalits' negotiations with the Indian modernity, etc., become more and more prominent in later works. Now, to conclude, Kardam's novel should be valued for the remarkable departures that it makes from the previous works of Dalit novels in Hindi. In the post-Mandal era of caste-activated public sphere, this work provides the roadmap of a new aesthetics by using Dalit consciousness as a literary and political framework in Hindi. This early Hindi Dalit novel becomes the repository of Dalit consciousness, where experiences of humiliation, the quest for social justice, assertion through education, and newly acquired social mobility have found their articulations with the question of representation and identity. In his continued treatment of the elements of the experiential as the epistemic basis, Kardam aligns himself with the tradition of self writings in Dalit literature. Dalit experience, mediated through Dalit consciousness, allows the growth and spread of anti caste countercultural ideological positions in Hindi Dalit novels, and thus also defines the representational politics of the Hindi Dalit literary sphere. The novel is also seen as an affirmation of the centrality that emerging Dalit middle class acquires in the evolution of Dalit novel in Hindi. In its understanding of constitutionalism and modernity, the novel defines the terrain of Hindi Dalit novel. Chappar, as a literary landmark, is also successful in establishing Kardam as a community intellectual in Hindi Dalit literacy sphere. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Abhinav, for choosing a novel that focuses on the Ambedkarite project of the attempt, the aspirational sort of attempt to achieve emancipation and upward social and economic mobility through education. Right, so that is one very important aspect. Uh, the last call for Preetha Mukherjee. Is she present? Ritika and Shabur, if you can access the list of people, can you see if she's present?
Ma'am, she is not present here. She
Okay,
did not join the meeting.
okay. So I've done my duty. I've called out for her and she wasn't there. So we will concentrate on the three papers that were presented. In the instructions to the chair, we were told to provide detailed feedback to each of the individual papers because these are young scholars and they would profit from the feedback, we were told. So first, yes, I will, give my feedback to each of these three individual speakers, and then I will take on questions. I already saw one question pop up briefly, and I'll take up the questions later on. The first is the paper by Ankit. Ankit, I think you made a very valuable point about the importance of the apostrophe, and you pointed out how untouchable problem is a very different thing than the untouchables problem, right? Untouchable apostrophe S. But yes, I also have to point out that you too have been rather careless at times, and both in your presentation and in the written paper that I received, you repeatedly spelled the name of the novel as Midnight Children. It is Midnight's Children, apostrophe S. So yes, don't overlook the apostrophe. That is very important. Yes, and what I think you made a good point where you said that the surname of Shiva is sort of erased, and that is why his class becomes more important than his caste. But I'm sure if you do a more detailed reading of the novel, you have to explore. There are lots of things that aren't explicit, right? That are implicit. You have to not just read between the lines, but you have to look at what we call the gaps, the silences, the erasures in the text, right? You have to look in the interstices of the plot. And I'm sure, just as you picked up Shiva, I'm sure there will be also, minor other incidents or characters where indirectly, without overtly stating it, Rushdie will be calling attention to the problem of caste. But yes, caste and class are often conflated for the very simple reason that the lower caste, the so-called Dalit or backward class, they are economically exploited. They are socially marginalized. So yes, class and caste are conflated, but I'm sure if you do a more detailed search, you will come across many more such instances, although I agree with you that the lens, the focus is not on caste. Anjali, in your paper, I think you drew attention to a very, very important inhuman practice. And yes, merely banning it by law doesn't achieve anything. In fact, we've all been talking about Dalit. We've used the word Dalit, and I'm sure it's being used in all the parallel sessions today and tomorrow. I don't know if you're aware, but a few years ago, there was a Government of India advisory that the word Dalit should not be used, right? Because it has negative connotations. So there was an advisory to the press council, to journalists, etc., that when they're reporting atrocities, the word Dalit, Harijan, or whatever, these words should not be used. Rather, the word used in the Constitution, scheduled caste, should be used. But the question is, by merely banning a word, they didn't ban it legally, it was an advisory. But by merely saying don't use a word, do you effect any substantial change in the social and economic position? I mean, I'm going to say something controversial. By being politically correct and referring to people with disability, right? Earlier we used to call, I don't know in your generation, but in our generation we used to say physically challenged. Now that has been changed to differently abled. But just changing the nomenclature or the term, does it really lighten the discrimination they face? Recently, as you know, a child was not allowed to board a flight. So just changing the name, just saying don't use the word Dalit is not going to change anything. Just as you rightly say, that although legally it's been banned, because you see, even if, let us say, India achieves 100% Swachh Bharat, let's say theoretically, even then manual scavenging will not be eradicated, because you know that human beings are sent down manholes to clean it, right? So yes, private toilets may no longer have manual scavenging if Swachh Bharat is achieved all over India, but till the PWD department adopt full mechanization and, like in other countries, send down robots instead of human beings, the problem of manual scavenging is still going to carry on. And I'm sure we've seen how, laborers stand, usually from the lower caste, stand in knee-deep dirt and take out the dirt from the drains and put it on the roadside. We've seen this, all of us. So yes, I think you focused on a very, very important aspect that needs to be highlighted. But I think when you are talking about the reports, the statistics, the non-fictional essays, etc., and then the literature, try to make a judicious mix of both of them, right? So when you're talking of the literary texts, maybe you should keep the literary section of your paper somewhat distinct. First, build in the entire context, I feel, the historical context, add the sociological reports, etc., and then go to concentrate on the literature. But yes, yours was a very, very valuable attempt. Abhinav, I don't know, is the paper you read cut short from the paper you sent?
No, ma'am. In fact,
No?
it's the exact paper.
It's exact. Okay.
Yeah.
Then maybe because there was a lot of noise from the construction next door, so maybe I missed that part. But yes, if you've read the exact sort of verbatim of what you've presented, one very important aspect I would wish you to concentrate on, and again, I think you did a very good job. One thing towards the ending of the novel, Chappar, frank confession, I haven't read the novel. Okay, I know Hindi, but I haven't read the novel. But from your analysis, when you talk of the ending of the novel, when suddenly these upper caste characters have a sudden change of heart and, they give up their rank, their title, and whatever, maybe you should concentrate on that more and show how there is probably a confusion of genres there, right? Because the main novel is written in the realist form, in the realist tradition, right? But there it becomes almost utopian. So the writer should be very clear about whether he's writing a realist fiction, painting the grim reality as it is, and not indulge, in fairy tale conversations, what we English literature students call the forest of Arden type of transformations, magic fairyland where the wicked become good, suddenly they have a change of heart. So either he's writing a realist novel when he's absolutely uncompromising with the truth, or he's writing an idealist, almost utopian fiction where he's trying to paint a society as it should be. But towards the end, it seems to me that the novel confuses the two. So maybe if you highlighted that dichotomy, it would be a very valuable sort of addition. Right.
May I give a remark,
Sure,
ma'am?
sure.
Right. You have, in fact, what you have pointed out is matter of a huge debate in the Hindi Dalit public sphere. Given that this novel was celebrated for the way it borrowed this whole framework of Dalit Chetna way back in 1994, when there were not many writings, especially in the realm of fiction, which were even remotely Ambedkarite, so to speak. So there is a context to this, and you are right that there is a certain confusion of the genre, but I have read it in my larger project as a hybrid sort of a genre, because in the paper itself I have made a remark where I do not see Kardam making a lot of departures from the self-writings which rely on the authentic experiential, and this kind of interjection of the Gandhian resolutions, which I have read as Gandhian resolutions, they have disturbed a lot of these Dalit authors, who go on to see it as an inadequacy of the vision of Jayaprakash Kardam. But you are right in pointing out that there seems to be a kind of a debate here, whether Jayaprakash Kardam should have sided with the brutal depiction of the reality of the feudal worlds of Uttar Pradesh, or this against this kind of utopian resolution. They do not seem to go along. But there is a very important attempt made by not just Jayaprakash Kardam but also by Mohandas Naimishraya, who's another contemporary of Jayaprakash Kardam. They go on to romanticize the Dalit characters. They go on to romanticize the Dalit in general, the Dalit experience, because for them this is an emblematic furthering of the Ambedkarite ideals. This is there are two kinds of audiences that Dalit novels are being presented to. One is to the non-Dalits, where look at the brutal reality of caste, and the second is the Dalits themselves, the first generation readers who probably need to look at these moral heroes, the political heroes, the social heroes. So Chandan, you see, at no point of time he has, although there is a later novelist called Ajay Navaria, in fact, he again has been questioned.
Abhinav, I really have to cut you short. I'm sorry about that because time is running out. Although
Sorry.
no, my apologies. You don't have to be sorry. I agree with you entirely that the Ambedkarite stand is very opposed to the Gandhian stand. Gandhi, in fact, glorified and romanticized manual scavenging, which obviously cannot be justified in any way. But briefly, yes, we already have two questions, but will the two other speakers like to respond? I want to give them an opportunity. First, Ankit, very briefly, Anjali, very briefly, before we go to first Hironno's question and then Shagor's question. Ankit?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much for pointing out the very obvious fault in my essay. It's almost ironical that I committed the FS apostrophes mistake because that was kind of a main argument of my paper. So I humbly take your criticism of the paper. And one thing just I wanted to point out that it has been almost a 40 year that the Midnight Children was published, and my like lack of maybe somewhat scholarly reading of the novel is somehow to deal with the fact that even after 40 year of like long time of period, there is no critical inquiry that inquire particular for this novel from a caste angle, whether Rushdie's intention was to elite caste or not, we can explore this. But this is some like a kind of uh, a, a problem with a critical post-colonial criticism of the novel that is in the prevalence. So there is just one point I wanted to highlight, and thank you very much. I hope that in future I'll be able to do a more detailed study of this novel and make my arguments more cogent. Thank you.
Okay, Ankit. Just do a more diligent search. I'm sure I find it hard to believe there are no critics addressing the caste angle. So do a more diligent search. Okay. Anjali, would you like to respond? Anjali, are you there? No. Okay. Hironno, your question just flashed for a moment and disappeared. I can't seem to find it. Can you repeat your question orally?
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt, but Anjali Das had unmuted herself. I think she would like to talk.
Anjali, go ahead.
Ma'am, actually, I don't have to say anything, and there is no question for me in the chat box. So I'll just look further to your comments and try to build my argument according to your instructions. Uh, that I'll I'll write a separate argument on literature, and I'll focus on my arguments on literature separately rather than mixing the two judicial things and the literature all together.
No, I'm not saying that you cut out the sociological and historical context, but just weave it in more skillfully, right? So, okay. Hironno, can you repeat your question orally?
Sure, ma'am. So, my question is for Mr. Abhinav Piyush. You mentioned the aspiration towards becoming an inspector or collector. To what extent do you think that the authentic identity of an individual from the Dalit community, that is, its unadulterated free expression, is sandwiched between the neoliberal individualist archetype of the aspirant towards social mobility and social stasis and stagnation within the oppressive caste sphere? That's
Yeah.
my question. Yeah.
Thank you, Hiranya. It's a very interesting question, because in my own paper, I have not really dealt with the limitations of the middle class modernity or the imaginations of the neoliberalism, how they are at play. But as I told you that this paper is a part of a project where the attempt is to map the emergence of Hindi Dalit writings, and this particular text where this character, the father figure, who is living out the brutal realities of the oppressive and the atrocity-ridden caste structure in the rural in northern India. Uh, this person imagines himself to be, or his son to become an inspector or a collector. Now, there are two, three things that you need to remember. One is that it's a text which is written in the immediate caste activated reality of 1990s. Post Mandal Commission agitations have happened. The political alignments and the identity politics around the Dalit subcaste, castes, as well as the suddenly the other backward classes. All this has become so in the political sphere and the social sphere of the 1990s is very much different from, let's say, how it is today. And there uh, and also it should be noted that the reservations for the scheduled caste does not come in 1991. It begins with the promulgation of the Indian Constitution itself. So but there is a renewed debate around this possibility of emancipation. Education suddenly becomes an instrument, and that too within the realm of literature. Uh, this kind of consciousness is absent in northern India. As if you read more about it, and there are many people who have written about it, how there has been no cultural protest or resistance culture that emanated from northern India, as let's say which emanated in Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra. And in the absence of such kind of anti-caste political culture, this sudden and renewed debate around education and employment, that is an instrument that has been used by Hindi Dalit writers who take up this question, and more or less they are a lot of them are very inspired from the Marathi Dalit writers who continue to see education as a force of emancipation. So there is a lot of interaction, there is a lot of interplay of the social and the political, and middle class belonging in itself is questioned more intricately in a later novel by Ajay Nawaria, who writes this brilliant novel in 2008, Udhar Ke Log. But what I have presented my paper as, or what I see in my own study of Hindi Dalit novel, is that Jai Prakash Kardam and Mohandas Naimishra, they too represent the first generation, so to speak, although they are able to reinvent themselves, and they're still.
Okay, Abhinav, sorry, I'll have to cut you short again because there's another question from
Sure.
Shagor and another from Ritika, and we are running out of
Sure,
time. Very
sure,
sorry.
sure.
Shagor, I can see your question, and I'll briefly sum it up. He says this is a question for you. There is a long tradition in regional literature about the disenfranchised communities, such as the low quote unquote castes, the working class, etc. These works are ideologically committed to the good cause of the marginalized as well. How do these texts differ from the ones coming out from someone's lived experience as a Dalit? I mean, the differences in terms of the literariness of the text. Please give a brief reply so that I can put in Ritika's
Yeah,
question.
this is a big debate in Hindi literature, so to speak. Because remember, and you go back to when you think about the writers or the writings which deal with caste as an issue in Hindi literature, they go back to the in 19th century as well. You go back to Premchand as well, where a lot of is done in probably either in under the influence of the Western modernity which has just arrived, or in the spirit of reformation, and which is where I also have a problem that Gandhi should not be read down so much, because at that point of a critical socio-political moment where it's not the world of 1990, it's not the world of 2000s. It's a very rigid society way back in 1915 and 1920s, where not even one single Congress leader probably is ready to talk about caste. So at that point of time, under the influence of Gandhi, a lot of these Hindi writers, they go on to write about caste. But at the same point of time, I have used 1990s and the onset of a kind of a caste activated social sphere in 90s to be able to showcase the arrival of a new aesthetics, is the arrival of the Ambedkar in the Hindi region, as far as I can speak, because Ambedkar does not reach. Remember, in Hindi region, it's Jajivan Ram. There are some grassroots movements which have happened pre-independence also, but Ambedkar never reaches to northern India till the time of 1991, when his Ambedkar's birth centenary is being celebrated. The VP Singh government also gives him Bharat Ratna at that point of time, and then suddenly you have this kind of, under the influence of Kanshi Ram and Mayawati, this kind of a new vocabulary of Dalit politics arrives. So in that sense, I will read these texts as pieces of literature which offer a different aesthetics, which help you understand the experiences of communities, of individuals in a very complicated social reality, as compared to what it was done by the Hindi writers in general, or regional writers, as you have said. uh, but it's an important assertion. It's an important moment when the Dalit writer takes up the cause of writing and writes himself into this kind of framework of literary or critical framework of Dalit Chetna. So
Okay, okay. Thank you, Abhinav. Sorry.
thank you so much.
Ritika, your question, I kept it for the last because, as you say, it's a general question. This is what Ritika writes. My question is rather generic and open to any presenter who may want to address it. Do you think it is possible to capture the reality of Dalit conditions in novels? Or does the incorporation of Dalit Chetna in a fiction somehow does it hamper the representation of reality? So maybe either Ankit or Anjali can respond. Ankit, would you like to respond?
Yes, ma'am. Just a second. Uh,
Very briefly, I'll open it to all three, so very briefly.
yes. Does the incorporation of Dalit Chaitanya fiction more represent? I think that the Dalit writer are precisely doing that. They are trying to capture it, their reality in novels as well as a short fiction. So this Tural Jatin Gajarwala pointed out that many Dalit writer first they started with the poetry and then they went on to use the form of a short story rather than novel. But I think there is a lot of a scope in the novel as a genre as well, where the realities can be represented. I'm not very
Okay,
yes.
Anjali, briefly, very briefly, we are running out of time. Anjali? No. Abhinav, I cut you short repeatedly. You have the last word.
Okay, ma'am.
We sign off.
Thank you so much. See, Dalit Chetna at no point of time compromises with the realist depiction of the novel. Uh, the idea here is very, very different. Dalit Chetna basically becomes a political tool to reimagine the Dalit characters. For them, it's a method of contesting the representations that have been there in the upper caste fiction, that have been there in the fiction or the text written about the Dalit characters. And now, which is where this whole idea of Dalitness becomes very, very important. Today in the keynote address, we heard Dr. Gajendra kind of, sidelining the word Dalit itself, which I disagree with, because in the imagination of the word Dalit, in the imagination of the Dalit Chetana, lies the formulation of the Ambedkarite ideas, lies the formulation of the Ambedkarite ideas of education, of the vocabulary of the human rights, of the vocabulary of social justice, as compared to, let's say, what he advocated as the use of the anti-caste and the casteless, which plays into the hands of the upper class, upper caste elitism, which kind of imagines a post caste kind of a world, and does not really help you understand the way caste operates in a lot of these hinterlands. So to be able to contest the feudal realities of caste even today, when there, there are issues regarding marriages, celebrations, birthdays, you will see violence on a daily basis being reported. So in that kind of context, Dalit Chetana becomes a very important literary tool, not just to contest caste, but also at the same point of time have a radical redefinition of the meaning of Dalit experience. So I hope I'm able to answer your question.
Okay. Thank you, Abhinav.
Thank you
We'll
so
bring
much.
this session to a close. And I want to sincerely thank all three speakers, the two hosts, Shagor and Ritika, for being there, right? The audience. And I hope you had a very, very stimulating and fruitful session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor
Thank you,
Shanta
ma'am.
Datta.